Okay, so I wanted to start broadly with with all these philosophers and historical people, what's how studying them impacted your life?
That's a broad and deep question at the same time. uh, what's a what would be a way to put this? I think it's first of all important to study some of the greatest minds in human history because human nature has not changed over the century, over the thousands of years that we've lived. We have the same inclinations towards wanting power, towards wanting fame, towards wanting riches. The nature of being human is that it just doesn't change. What changes is the preferences. What changes is the technology. It gets more advanced, right? You and I, we're talking to you thousands of miles apart. And so reading these philosophers, reading, it's not just philosophers, reading great thinkers of from human history allows you to live a thousand lives so that when you live your own life, you know the type of mistakes that are common to man, the type of mistakes that you can avoid, but it also gives you a guide as to what you can do with your life, how you want to live out your life. There might be things, say, like, say you're a big fan of Napoleon, right? Napoleon's a guy who's well um, revered and enjoyed and studied by lots of tech entrepreneurs. And that's because Napoleon lives this life. And once it's very lavish, right? He comes up after the revolution. He's this big leader. He wins all these wars. And so there's this sort of connection that entrepreneurs have, right? They want to take over the world in their industries. But at the same time, you can get this shallow understanding of Napoleon as this great man. But then when you look into it, he abandons his unit, soldiers, twice, right? But if you don't know that, you might think that he's the greatest and you might try to emulate everything about his life. But when you study that, you realize, okay, Napoleon obviously was also human, had at one point freaked out and abandoned his soldiers. Some people say, he abandoned it so that he could go back to his wife, but he still abandoned it versus, some of the old great emperors, they would be the first one to be in the front of the line. So if they died, that's part of being a king, that's part of leading your pack. So all that to say, the lessons that I've learned is precisely that it's taught me what is it and how is it that I want to live my life, right? Do I want to live my life pursuing all the fame and riches? Do I want to pursue the thing that society says we should do, which is to climb the social ladder, the corporate ladder? And that's all that there is to do, right? Where I've realized that that is not, there's nothing necessarily wrong with it in doing that if it's helping you pursue the intellectual life more, if it's helping you to provide for your family, none of that, that's nothing wrong with it. But if it's the sole game that you're playing, and it's the sole game of dominating another human being and dominating people and exploiting people and, taking advantage of people, and your whole persona is around how much, money can I make, how much wealth can I acquire, and how much of it can I keep for myself. Whereas when you read, say you read Lao Tzu's very small book, Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu lived 2,500 years ago, right? You would think that there's no real similarities between our lives and his life. But Lao Tzu realized very early on, and he says, know what is enough and you'll be rich, right? Meaning for us, once you and I understand what it is that we want, what it is that we want to live for, then all the other things just becomes a distraction, right? It's like when Nietzsche's demon comes to you and says, hey, Joel, hey, Jacob, you know what? Here's a surprise. You have to repeat this life over and over again for eternity. And you go, oh, shit. Yeah, that doesn't sound too good to me. Like maybe I've been living the life the wrong way around. And so I think for me, that's essentially been it. It's allowed me to see my life through the eyes of all these philosophers and come to a point, and I'm still coming to a point of narrowing it down to the path and the walk that I want to walk on, right?
Yeah, that's really nice. To me, it sounds like a search for wisdom, and wisdom that remains consistent across time and across ages, that then informs you on, and you can sort of create your own interpretations of that and decide how you want to like go and live your life. I think that's really nice. You touched on like the message there from Lao Tzu's work. I think what would be nice for this conversation is, are there any more specific examples of little lessons and things you've learned from certain figures in history that then we can unpack and talk about? So that maybe 3 examples, but start from one and we'll bounce off it and see where that goes.
3 examples in regards to how I've changed the way I live my life, or 3 examples of like 3 general examples. What do we
sort of like, if I was to ask you what were some of the greatest lessons that you've learned from your research and your interest in these kind of people and the wisdom that you've gained from that, what were some key ones that come to mind first? Do you know what I mean? Don't think too much into it. What are the ones that pop up in your head at the beginning?
I think the one for sure is the one I mentioned with Lao Tzu, right? Know what is enough, and you'll be rich. I think that is important. That has been a very important lesson for me, right? As someone who wants to do all these things, attain all these goals, and that's not, and the inclinations and desires that I have is nothing unique to me, right? You guys have that, listeners have that, but that particular lesson in Lao Tzu, which is also common, which is a lesson that in a different way that Jesus from the Bible, he says, what profits a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Which is very similar insofar as the point is, what's the point of getting all these material things that are ultimately ephemeral, right? You can't take with you to the grave. Like once you die, that's it. You're born naked, you die naked. Everything in between, you think you can have, you think you can possess, but it's all gone. And so that particular lesson for me is sort of a recurring reminder. And I always go back to it. I always think about it, because there are times when I'll go to, when I'm reflecting, I'm like, oh man, why did I want this so much? And then it might turn out that I wanted it because I wanted to, say, impress my friend, right? My particular friend in a particular industry. And I was like, yeah, even if I got to impress them, let's say, and then they gave me a ring and said, man, IJ, or XYZ, that was awesome. I'm super impressed by it. I'm super inspired by it. That only lasts for a minute, right? Maybe 10 minutes, say you feel good about it. But even if my friend never messaged me about it, never told me that he impressed me, it should be that the external factors shouldn't be what determines how I feel, how I act, and who I am. So that I would say would be the first one. The second one would be the importance of practicing and implementing silence in your life and solitude. And that's something that I've done for quite a few years. I was obsessed with working. I was obsessed with, okay, how much work can I do in a week, right? You rack up all these hours and you're like, yeah, man, I did such, I put in so much time. I feel pretty good. I feel like a man. And then you realize, similar to what Lao Tzu is saying, so you realize, in the process of this chasing that we're doing of these things that are ultimately vanity, you realize that you may have missed the most important thing in your life, which is spending time with your family, spending time with your friends, truly understanding who you are. So what the practice of solitude and silence has taught me is, it is only in the stillness of your life that you're able to understand who you are, what are your doubts, what are your fears, what are the things that you love, what are the things that you hate, what are the things that you're afraid of. And through those moments, can you be honest with yourself. And in those moments, for me, is when I've been able to shape and direct more intentionally where I'm headed towards. So there's a book which I've mentioned on my podcast quite a few times, but I actually haven't done this book yet. But it's called The Power of Silence by Robert Cardinal Sarah. And he's a priest. And this book was gifted to me my wife in 2017, 2018. And the first time I read it, it just changed the way I understood meditation, changed the way I understood prayer, right? So certain people who are religious will pray, certain people are not religious, or say they're agnostic or whatever in the middle. They don't want to say they pray, so they'll say I'm meditating or I'm doing mindfulness practice. It doesn't matter to me, right? But in that book, Cardinal Sarah says something very important, and he says, we live in a world of noise and of distraction, and most people want to find God in the noise. But the only time you find God is in the silence of your heart, when it's just you and there's nothing else. You might be praying and you might be asking, hey, I want to do this XYZ, or I want XYZ to happen to me. And there's essentially just an echo. It feels like it's going nowhere. But he's saying in those moments, in that very, very still, quiet moment, is when you actually hear the voice of God. Now, I'm obviously saying the voice of God, but to me, it's that moment where you can truly see reality for itself, right? See who you are without the facade that all of us put on, right? We put on all these masks to impress other people. You practice all this. I might say, oh yeah, I read 1,000 books in like 3 years. I haven't read 1,000 books in 3 years, but let's just say I say all these things to impress you and then impress somebody else. But ultimately, I read these books, it's not to impress other people. It shouldn't be. It should be for myself, right? And everything else is just a side effect of it. So those are I would say those are the two main things that come to my mind: solitude and understanding who you are, such that you know what it is that you want, and not being distracted by the noise.
Yeah, that's really nice. I think that what a lot of that sounded like to me, a common theme was like this wise work that you're looking on from people in history, or some people in the modern day I've seen that you've looked at, is like showing you a different narrative for how to live life than the one that's sort of the autopilot protocol of the world we live in. Like you talked about the amount of noise there is, and the amount of things that the world tells you should want, and the amount of pressures to impress people and rise up the social hierarchy. This kind of ability, I like what you're talking about when you're saying practicing silence, like being able to sort of shut off that noise and actually reflect on what do you want? Or there's a big podcaster you might know called Chris Williamson, and he talks about this question of
modern wisdom.
Yeah, that's the one. And he talks about this question you should ask yourself of, what do I want to want? Because there are so many things that we want in life. We want the nice car, we want the pretty girl, we want the big biceps, we want the stack of money, but we also want wisdom, and we also want love, and we also want connection, right? We all have that plethora of desire, right? But if we actually look at all the desires we possibly could have, which ones do we want, and which ones do we want to aim for? So no, I really, am I on the right lines there with what I'm saying?
Yeah, I would say so. I think I think that's very well. I actually haven't heard that from Chris Williamson. Now, mind you, I don't actually listen to his podcast. I've listened to a few episodes, so I know that the episodes I've listened to I've quite enjoyed. He's an English guy, right?
Yeah,
if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And I think a more recent example, I should say a very recent example, I just saw a clip of this on Twitter, is the founder of Telegram, whose name totally slips my mind. But he's being interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and there's a clip that I saw where he says, "Oh yeah, I don't actually own real estate. I don't own yachts. I don't own big mansions. Obviously he has a ton of cash. Mind you, he's like, oh yeah, I just own, cash and Bitcoin in my account. That's all I have, because I know what it is that I want, and I don't want the yacht. I don't want the real estate. I don't want." So that's, that's obviously a somewhat modern and, closer to what we're saying is that he understands what it is that he wants, and he's not distracted by all the things that other people say he should be distracted. All the people say, oh yeah, you should be in Monaco with a yacht watching the F1. And it's like, no, I'm not interested in that. For him, all he wants to do is build Telegram, bring privacy to the users, whatnot. Right? And so I think it's important, not just in our day-to-day life, not just in our relationship, not just in our friendship, but if you do business, it's important for you to know what your values are, right? So let's say you guys have this pod. You get big, people start coming to you. Hey, Joel, hey, Jacob, you know what? I'll pay you. Let's do a sponsorship deal. 10 episodes, 100 grand for 10 episodes. You're like, wow, that sounds great. 100 grand for 10 episodes. But then they say, but you can't talk to IJ. Yeah, we don't like the stuff that he says. And you say, if you are only about money, if you're only about, making as much money as possible, you might be like, sounds good to me. I'll take it. Right. But if you understood what it is that you were after, if it was truly around being open-minded and talking to people and, developing a catalog of knowledge, not just for yourself, but anybody else who comes and listens to, you'd be like, yeah, F off. I don't care about the money. I'm not here for the money. I'm here for the wisdom. I'm here to understand. I'm here to create a platform where not only can we learn, but that conversation can be listened to by everybody else. Even if we disagree with them, then that's a totally different value proposition now the podcast has, right? And so I think ultimately it's important to know yourself, to know what it is that you stand for, so you can have conviction in those moments, in those very seductive moments that will happen to us.
Yeah, it's like what was questioned about Rogan's Spotify deal as well. But there's also like a common theme of gratitude here, I think, especially with being rich with what you already have and appreciating what you already have. But with the solitude and the importance of silence, have you practiced this? And if so, like, what have you learned?
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I've practiced for certainly since 2017, 2018, when I read that book with Robert Cardinal Sarah, right? That was the monument. And that was around the time that my wife and I were going through a very difficult, tragic time in our lives. And so that, couple that with reading the book, couple that with me training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, all of those sort of led together to me understanding, to me getting to a point where I realized, I have all this anger that I was feeling, right? Of like, why is it that, this tragedy had to happen to us? Why is it that we have to suffer? Why is it that I have to suffer? As I was going, and then only realizing that it was in the moment where it was just myself, right? My wife was not there. My friends were not there. And it's just me and myself lying in the bed, awake, thinking about what's happening to us and going, yeah, there's nobody else in this world, including my wife, who's going to pull me out of this rut, right? She's also going through something difficult. And no amount of me distracting myself with trivial pleasures to avoid the suffering and the pain that's happening is going to actually heal the pain. The only way through the suffering, the only way to overcome the suffering is by going through the suffering. And the only way you can go through that suffering is being still, is being silent, is finding a time for solitude where you can allow that suffering to come up, right? Instead of pushing it, boil up to the surface so that you can witness it, so that you can address it, so that you can essentially sit in that suffering. Because it's only through that you'll overcome it. Otherwise, the suffering can turn into a problem where that suffering starts to draw you away from what's good in your life and start to draw you into things, and you start to develop addictive personalities around whatever it is, things that are not good for you. It could be anything. me, that practice when I was having, and it took me, a year, more than probably like 2 years to fully overcome the pain and suffering. But that left a very strong impression on me. And so now I'd say once every 6 months at best, at worst, once every 6 months at worst, I'll find a weekend, like, Saturday, Sunday, sometimes Friday, Saturday, Sunday, so 3 days, where I do a silent retreat. Well, it could be in my house, it could be in a friend's house, it could be somewhere else. It could be, I haven't actually gone to the woods, but it'll be great if I can go to the woods, where those 3 days are very specific days of silence. Now, those happen, once or twice every 6 months, so 2 to 4 times a year. But the rest of it is my daily practice in the morning before my family wakes up, right? Or it's in the middle of the night when everybody's asleep, if I did do it in the morning. Or if it's at like 12 in the afternoon when I've eaten lunch and I'm like, okay, my family sleep, my daughter's sleeping and it's quiet in the house, and then I can get into it. So in a small way, I practice it in a small way throughout, like every day. And then in a big way, I do it like once every 6 months. And I recommend this to friends as well, right? And one thing that we're trying to do, a friend of mine specifically, because I've been trying to book this spot. There's a spot here in Quebec, which is a province in Canada, and there's a Benedictine monastery. Okay, and the Benedicts, they practice a vow of silence, and so anybody can book a weekend or like a few days there and do a silent retreat with the monks. And I've been trying to book this for like a year, maybe just over a year. And it's always booked out. And so after this conversation, if they're still open, I'm going to give them a call to try to get a time slot in before it gets booked up for the rest of the year. And that's going to be, for me, the second time this year that I would be doing it. So if it's in July, it'd be like in the first 6 months, I would have done a 2. But yeah, it's ultimately, it's been very helpful, right? It allows you to also process all the things that you're reading, process all the conversations that you're having, right? It's always, I'm sure you guys do this as people who are lovers of wisdom and people who read, that you write your thoughts out, right? Whether that's like after a conversation or not. At least I found that when I used to have a podcast where I was talking to people, it'd be very helpful for me after the podcast just to write, a blurb down of what I learned. Like, oh yeah, I talked to so-and-so and this is what they talked about. And then it just kind of keeps it fresh in my mind. Otherwise, it's easy to have this conversation and walk away and then never think about it. And then so.
Me and Joe are writing notes now, I think.
Yeah, definitely. That's it.
That's awesome.
I really like I really like this. I'm so fascinated by that. I mean, me and Jacob have talked before about how we want to go and sort of do a month or something as a monk, and
oh, you should
go through that routine and put our minds through that to see what we've learned about ourselves and about the world and what we want. It's all just so like fascinating to me. But like, so on these silent retreats, is it just sort of, like you say, a lot of writing and reflecting and meditation? And do you go out in nature? What do you do all day? Because I know it's like, it's supposed to be silent time, but you've got 14 hours between waking and sleeping.
Yeah.
Like, what happens
14
there?
hours, exactly. Yeah, 14 hours. And if you wake up early, it's sometimes closer to like 16 to 18 hours, right? If you wake up early, if you're up at 4, it's a long day. It's a very long day. And then by the time it's like 4, by the time it's like 6 p.m., you're like, man, I've been awake so long. And then your mind starts to go like a bit wonky. And so you just go to bed early. But what I do is wake up before, when I used to drink coffee, which I no longer do, unfortunately. It'd be like, wake up, make coffee, drink the coffee, sit down, like all that normal stuff that I would do like the way that I do the silent retreat is slightly different, not slightly, quite different from my day-to-day meditative practice. So my day-to-day would be like I wake up and then I would do my meditation and my prayer. On the silent retreat, I don't do it as the first thing. So my first thing is not to do the meditation, because basically the whole day is my meditation, right? So it's not like I stack it in the beginning and then I read up. So it'd be like I said, make coffee, tea. For me, it's now tea. And then just try to enjoy that tea. Because the funny thing, a side tangent, the funny thing is, about a year, maybe almost a year and a half ago, I had this super weird coughing issue, right? Okay. Where I would just cough uncontrollably. And especially when I was teaching jitsu, I'll be like, as I'm talking to them, and I just start coughing, and then all the guys would be like, man, what's happening to IJ? Is he dying? I'm like, just give me a sec. And I'll cough for like 30 seconds straight, and my voice would be rasped. And then I was like, I couldn't figure it out. And then I worked with a personal trainer and nutritionist. And she was like, tell me about your eating habits. I'm going through all this stuff. She's like, yeah, I meditate, I do all this stuff. And, she's sort of holistic. So she was asking me all these things. And she's like, okay, so tell me about your eating habits. I was like, eating habits? I was like, I just eat my food. Like, what do you want to know about it? So it's like, well, how fast do you eat your food? I was like, well, speed is not really an issue for me. I will just chop my food down. Like, there's no like thinking about my food. I'll just eat my food. She's like, do you like chew, 3, 4, I think she said 5, 10 times. And then so I was like, no, I'll just eat. Like, if there's food here, I'll eat it as fast as possible. And she's like, well, that might be your issue, IJ. You might, your body might be reacting because you're not eating your food mindfully. And I felt very stupid because of this. And it was like I never put together mindful meditative practice into the way I ate my food, right? So it was like I would do it in the rest of my life, but when it came to food, it was monstrous. It was as if, I was like trying to devour this food as fast as possible. And she's like, I want you to practice when you're eating your food to be very slow, to be very thoughtful. I guess to use the term, be very mindful of the food that you're eating. At first I was like, this sounds stupid. This sounds totally stupid. But I did it and my coughing stopped, right? It was just the acid reflux basically stopped. And I went back to my doctor and he was like, what did you do? I was like, I'll be totally honest. I just did this thing that my nutritionist said, which is mindful eating. And he's like, okay. My doctor just left it at that. So all that to say, for me in these silent retreats, it's implementing the mindful eating / drinking tea in the morning. And so once I've done that, it's feeding. So I'll read. I'm not somebody who can read straight for like 2-3 hours. I know some friends of mine, some people can read straight 2-3 hours. I'll read at max, if I push it, like an hour, right? So I'll read for an hour, 45 minutes to an hour, take a break, about 15 minutes, walk around, make another cup of tea, do something that doesn't involve engaging my mind, right? And then I would return to it. So I would do it for about 3 hours. Altogether, it'll take me about 3 hours to, I would say, like 4 hours, depending on how much I'm doing it. And then after that is writing. And that to me is the most important thing. Because what ends up happening for me on the silent retreat is, as I'm reading, I'll start to think about all these connections, right? They'll start coming to me. I was like, oh, wow, this is incredible. But if I start writing, I won't stop writing. So I have to control myself to not write things down, because once I start writing, I don't want to go back to read, because I'll just keep writing and writing. So I sort of like, in the beginning is read, sort of saturate my mind with what I'm reading. And then the next 2 hours, usually it takes me about 2 hours to just write. And it's not like I'm writing essays upon essays, but it's just I'm trying to write things in a way that if I were to reread it, I would understand what I'm saying. I don't do, I forget what that's called. Word vomit, I think that's what it's called. I forget what it's called, where you just kind of write what comes to your mind. I think that's helpful for when you actually need to get things out. But if you consistently write, it's generally not a problem to write, because you know what it is that you want to say. So do that. And then in the evening is the meditation, the practice. So I'll do like different. There are all sorts of different like breathing practices. So sometimes I'll experiment. And I was like, oh, this. I read this. I read about this particular type of holotropic breathing that I haven't done before. I might as well try it. So I'll sort of have those in mind before I actually get into it. So I'm not like on YouTube scrolling, and by the end of it, I'm like 30 minutes and I was like, oh shit, I forgot to actually do my actual meditation because I've been searching. So then in the evening, it's those cooking. And so when I'm cooking as well, I try to be as present as possible. All these things I'm saying sounds totally simple and very easy to do. When I'm doing it, like when I'm cooking and making my food, for example, to be fully present and locked into like chopping an onion, it's not as easy for me as I say it is, right? It's like as I'm chopping, my mind be like, oh shit, okay, I got to get my my garam masala, I got to get my salt, I got to get my pepper, I got to get my my oregano. But it's like my mind's always running, so like always trying to bring it back. Okay, I'm just chopping the onion, like that's all I'm doing. And then by the end of it, I always find that if I do it well, there's a deep satisfaction that comes to like when I'm actually making the food. It's like, wow, I feel like I was fully present in the food that I made, that I'm about to consume. And so when I'm consuming it, same thing, right? The mindfulness eating, doing that more so than I did a few years ago. And then I try to sleep early, which is important. People say, oh, this is a friend of mine, we were talking about like our routines and habits. And I was like, yeah, I don't recommend my routine to anybody because some people might be like, this is insane. This is stupid. Like, but he's like, okay, I was like, what's your morning routine? He's like, oh, I wake up at 6:30. I think it's at 6:30 or 6. He has 2 kids, and then I do my prayer, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, oh, it's yours. I was like, man, it's like my morning, it can range between like 3 a.m. to like 6 a.m. So like if I wake up in between time, I'm going to wake up and I'm going to do my stuff. But the problem is if I'm up at 3:30, by the time 9 comes along, I've been awake for 6 hours and I am like hyped. I'm ready, right? And then at the time that 6 p.m. rolls around, I'm tired, right? And so the solitude moments, it's like, okay, if I wake up super early, I have to sleep early. Otherwise, my mind will not be able to fall. So like if I wake up super early and I don't sleep by 10:30, I can't fall asleep, which sounds ridiculous, but my mind just starts to wander and it becomes very hard. So that's essentially, you repeat that like twice. So the same thing following day. And then if it's 3 days, then on the third day is more so writing than anything else. So the first 2 days will be more reading, and then on the third day is more writing and meditation. And generally, I don't go on walks as often as I would like to, but like recently when I did it, a week or 2 weeks ago, I did like a 1 day silent day, I should say. That one I was like intentionally going out for a walk. I was like, wow, this is great. I feel great. I know I always feel great going for a walk, a 45-minute walk, which for some people is just weak sauce. But I was like, wow, this 45-minute walk, I feel exhausted. My mind feels rested at the same time because I was trying to be present and doing all this stuff. So that's what it is. Long way, about 3 days, reading, drinking my coffee, mindfully reading, writing, meditation, sleeping, and then repeating.
Joel, your monk mode days come to mind, but like you're not as extreme.
Yeah, no. I feel like I need to get back to a sense of that. Not to that extreme, but maybe nice once a month to do a day where you just detox. Do you know what I mean? Like no phone, no work, no stimulation, just a good book you want to read, and pen and paper. Because it just gives you a moment to pause, doesn't it? Like, because if you don't do that and you just live and then go to sleep, you don't get time to actually reflect on the life you're living. You're just in it all the time, constantly being bombarded with noise. And I want to pivot slightly and go back to something you said a little earlier, which sort of does link to this, which is about how the silence allows you to not avoid suffering, and how like then you're not being sort of bombarded with all this noise and this stimulation allows you to address the things that are painful and that you're struggling with to then actually go through those things. And it links to a question that I had, which is like, your podcast and your Substack is called Becoming Antifragile, right? And are those two ideas related, that being able to like sit with yourself and reflect in silence and address the things that are disturbing you means that you aren't this fragile self that has to distract itself from what it's going through? And through that introspection and through moving through the difficulty, you then become anti-fragile and able to navigate the world and our experience a lot more easy.
That, I think you put that very well. I don't think I've ever put it together in that combination of words, so I'm going to have to use the way you put it. Yeah, so becoming anti-fragile is, for me, is being able to thrive amidst the chaos of life, right? So you guys are young. If you haven't suffered already, you will suffer tremendously at one point in your life. And that's just something where you cannot escape, right? And when it happened to me, I knew about it, abstractly I knew about it. Abstractly, I had lost family members when I was young. But when it happens to you in a very direct way, when you're much older, there's a sense in which the pain becomes so real that it actually feels like you're something in you has died. That's what it feels like. And that pain is tremendous. And so and I don't say this in a sort of motivational, machoistic manner, right? But if that pain and that suffering, if you're not prepared for it, and if you're not willing to engage in it, it will destroy you. It will lead you to suffer more, and it will lead you down a very dark path where you might end up thinking that this life, this existence is not worth living. So why do I have to suffer? Why not just relieve myself of this suffering? And then you essentially commit suicide, which historically lots of people have done, right? And an example off the top of my head that comes to me is what's his name? Leo Tolstoy, right? In Confessions, his book. He's essentially has everything that you can ever want. Extremely wealthy, considered basically the greatest novelist that's ever, one of the greatest novelists that's ever existed. And he's given that title while he's still alive, all under the age of 50. But he realizes that all this is meaningless, except the suffering that he experiences is not the suffering of losing a loved one. It's not the suffering of losing his business. It's not the suffering of losing his status. It's literally the suffering of the mind. He realizes that everything that he has is totally and completely useless. He can't take it with him to the grave, right? He tells an Eastern fable where it's like, life is like a man being chased by a bull, and then out of sheer panic, he jumps into a well. And as he's falling down the well, there's a massive dragon waiting to eat him. And so the man freaks out. And he knows that if he releases his hand from the branch, he's going to get consumed by the dragon. If he climbs out, the bull's going to, kill him. So he hangs onto the branch as tightly as possible. But he realizes, as he's holding onto him, that there are two mice, white and black mice, slowly gnawing away at the branch. So this guy is either going to die by climbing out because he doesn't want the branch to break off, or he's just going to wait for those two mice to eat and gnaw away and then let time inevitably do the work of dropping. But in the midst of all of this, the branch releases honeydew. And the guy, knowing full well that all this is meaningless, he deludes himself into believing that the honey is sweet. And so he'll lick the honey. And he's saying, that was my life, right? That's what Leo Tolstoy is saying. And so all this to say, he he was on the verge of suicide when this is happening. And so he ultimately ends up not committing suicide. He ends up finding a purpose to live. And so but the point about becoming anti-fragile is that if you are not careful, you will be like the man hanging it, thinking that life is totally meaningless, and you're gonna either drop into the dragon's mouth or climb out and think that and just give up. Whereas if you are anti-fragile, the suffering that happens in your life, the pain that you go through, it doesn't destroy you. It actually makes you stronger. It makes you thrive. It makes you a better. I don't like to use the word better, but it makes you a better human being. You become more virtuous. Your ability is also not the right word here, but you are able to suffer virtuously through the situations that you're going through, right? And that's what becoming anti-fragile is. And all of that, like you said, requires solitude in your life. All that requires you to fully understand the weight of whatever it is that's going through, the weight. It allows you to understand how severe it is, and also realize that within you is the strength to overcome the suffering, and within you is the higher man who can overcome the lower man. And the lower man's the one who wants to give up, who wants to go, you know what, I give up and let life happen to me, and I'll just take it as it goes. But it's like, yeah, let life happen to you. It's true. Nobody can control what happens to us. Nobody can control what happens tomorrow. One of you could die tomorrow. I could die tomorrow. But if you have come to peace with yourself, if you have come to peace with your mortality, if you actually faced your death, when death comes, it's not to be so nonchalant about it. But when death comes, you can welcome death as a friend. You could say, I'm ready for you. And instead of cowering and thinking, oh shit, I haven't done this in my life, I should have said sorry to Jacob for pissing you off the other day, or I should have said I love you more to my loved ones. You don't have any of those regrets, even if that means you live life in the eyes of other people as not quote unquote successful, right? And a good example of this would be, have you ever read this very small book called In the Presence of God by Brother Lawrence?
No.
Okay. It's a very small book. Brother Lawrence, monk up, of course. But the whole book is his reflection on life. And the zenith point of this book is, in everything that you do, in every single moment, you have to be fully grateful for that existence that you have. And if you're able to do that, you can live a life that's much more fulfilling, much more meaningful than somebody who, in the eyes of the world, is extremely successful, but is unable to enjoy successes, right? Yeah, that's the way I would say at Becoming Antifragile. That's what it means.
As Nietzsche just said, you got to find meaning in the suffering.
That's right. Yeah, 100%. There's I would say one thing around that is the best way to understand what it means to be in solitude is if you practice any sort of combative martial arts, right? Whether that's Muay Thai, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, boxing, sambo, whatnot. You'll notice that when you're doing those, so for me, it's jiu-jitsu specifically. So when I'm doing Brazilian jiu-jitsu, in the early days when I didn't know anything, right, my mind had to be completely focused on what was happening to me. Otherwise, I was going to get strangled. My arm was going to be on the verge of getting dislocated. My leg was on the verge of getting broken. So I had to be fully dialed into what was happening. And it was actually through jiu-jitsu that the words of Cardinal Robert Serra became very practical to me. It's when I realized, oh, I see. It's a silence in a very different sense, where with jiu-jitsu, with any sort of martial art, you stop thinking, right? Once you understand how to do the sport, you actually stop thinking and you can just do the action. And for me, that was once you practice solitude, you're able to get into a state and allow your mind to reflect without actually doing any sort of reflecting work, if that makes any sense.
And I'm guessing like when you're being like fully present when you're eating food, does it like taste better?
For me, it does now. It's funny. It does now. Not that I did, not that I didn't enjoy the food before. It's more enjoyable. I generally don't. The one thing I should say, if you're doing a silent retreat or a solitude, or like a weekend of practicing solitude, it's very important, if you're like me, to have a plan for eating. Because for me, I tend to forget to eat. And so like me waking up, actually making breakfast, that's a conscious work that I have to do. Me making food in the evening, as you probably heard, as I was describing my day, there was no lunch involved because usually I forget to eat lunch. And so having a plan of like, okay, I'm going to eat here is very good, because you don't want to get to the end and you feel totally exhausted, because the days are quite exhausting.
Yeah, I think it's quite a common trait that what people are looking for a lot in their lives are moments where that inner monologue that's constantly talking in our ear shuts off. And that could be through combat sports or any, like, so I play wheelchair basketball, and when I'm in a game environment, it is like tunnel focus. Everything zones out. Yeah. It could be through meditation. It could be when you're walking out in nature. It could be playing music. It could be anything, like lifting weights in the gym, all those kind of things. Usually something physical as well, I think, is sort of a common theme amongst it, but you can find it through sort of meditation as well. But we're all looking for a time where that constant rumination in our minds just slows down. And we actually are, what I think it is you go from a state of thinking to a state of being. It's almost like you become the thing that you're doing. Because there's no commentary. There's no like meta analysis of what's going on, right? You are just the thing. Like, you are just playing the basketball game. You are just in that combat with that person. You become the song that you're playing, right? And I feel like that is a really transcendental state where you lose yourself. And that, I think that's what sort of psychologists like Abraham Maslow were talking about when they talked about peak experiences, when you feel like you're doing exactly what you need to be doing. And I think many people are searching for that. Do you agree?
It's the Wu Wei from Tao Te Ching, right? When Lao Tzu says, you have to get to a point where you do action with no action. It's like, what are you even talking about? It's like action on action. I think the literal translation of Wu Wei's action on action. But you understand what he's saying when you've experienced that sort of flow state. Flow state is flow. I use flow state because it's probably the closest like scientific term that we've gone closer to. But it is precisely what you say. You are able to do the activity in and of itself, not to do something else, right? Not to impress somebody else, not to get better at whatever it is. You do the activity for itself. And when you do it, you become fully present in the moment. The past doesn't dictate what you do. The future state of what might happen doesn't dictate what you do. You're fully there and you're fully engaged in the movement, right? I obviously I'm using Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu terms there, but you're fully engaged with what your opponent is doing back to you, right? It becomes this like lively conversation where you're fully involved in it. And I think the music example is probably a very good one, right? If the violinist stops playing the music stops. But if the violinist thinks too much about what to play next, right, the music is very sharp and very rigid. But once they get into the flow, it's a very beautiful piece of music that sounds good to you. It sounds good to the person playing, and you're able to be absorbed in that moment.
Yeah, that's nice. Go on, Jacob.
I wonder if you can be in this like peak experience for like the whole day.
I certainly have never experienced it for a whole day, and I had this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday on precisely this. Um, and he made a very good point, and he said, I was thinking about, we were talking. He's like, yeah, I think if you were in this state the whole day, then you would never really think about the future. You never think about the food you're going to eat on in the evening. You're never going to think about, oh, I have to go meet my family here, because you get so lost in it. And I hadn't really thought about it that way, but I the only response that I had was, I was like, yeah, that makes sense. But I also am not certain that you couldn't be in that state and forget the things that you were going to do, because I think, right, the whole point of our existence, in one sense, in a very simplified sense, is to be fully alive in the moments of our existence, right? To be fully present in this conversation that I'm having. I'm fully present here. Like my phone's, I don't even know what my phone. Actually, my phone's the camera here, but my phone's on silent. It should be on silent. I've got my headphones in, so I'm fully dialed in here. And so the conversation I'm having, I'm not being distracted. It allows me to, when you ask me questions or when I'm responding it back to you back and forth, it's truly me responding and not a facade that I'm putting on. Whereas I think you could do this exact thing with every task that you have. If, say, when you start the day, you know exactly what it is that you want to do ahead of time. You're like, okay, today I'm going to do this pod. I'm going to read the books. I'm going to, do work. And you can go into each of those states fully present and fully ready to engage and step into the river of that activity. I think you could do it. And I suspect that when you read some of these guys, you suspect that that's what they're doing, right? You like when you read Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching, or you read the gospel, and you look at Jesus' life, right? Every morning he practices solitude. He wakes up before anybody else, climbs the mountain, and sits in silence for, I don't know, who knows how many hours. But he's able to come back down and engage the crowd, to do his sermons, to do his preaching. But the theme that's common across all of these guys is, it seems like they all do two things very well, and that's silence, and which rejuvenates their spirit, which allows them to care, to love more deeply, so that when they're actually doing an activity, right, when they're talking to somebody, when they're working, it seems like I keep saying this word, but it seems like they're fully alive in their activity.
Yeah. This is what people should sort of aim for then, right? Because being fully present is like you're living in truth, which I don't think is the same when you're often distracted.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a sense in which, if I assume you guys, and it's totally okay if you don't, but I assume that you guys do some sort of meditative work, praying or whatnot, and you can tell me if I'm wrong here, but on the days that you miss doing it, right, on the days you wake up, you're like, oh shit, I gotta rush out because I got to do this thing, and then you forget to do, take a moment for yourself. I don't even want to use that word, but you take a moment to calm your spirit and calm your soul, calm your mind. On those days, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, I suspect that your mind is totally scattered, and you're not able to dial in as much as you want to. Because for me, that's almost always the case. On the mornings that I wake up, and I get rushed, because I was like, okay, I want to get this book read as fast as possible before, say my daughter wakes up, and then my day gets carried on, and it's like 1:00. I was like, okay, the last 3 hours has been less focused than I would have liked to.
Yeah, no, I fully relate to that. Like, it just sort of quite isn't it again it quietens that inner monologue that's constantly talking, and I'm able to sort of have a bit more focus on the thing that I'm doing in that moment, and it makes me think about that bit that Alan Watts said where he goes like, the person who thinks all the time thinks about nothing except thoughts, and therefore they're cut off from reality, right? And it's that idea that thinking is you're never in the present when you're thinking, right? Because the mind has to go to the past or the future to create a thought. It's either reflecting on something that's happened before or conceptualizing a potential future. And when you're in either of those two states, you're not in the reality that you're living right now, right? So I think that's what I get when Jacob says like that's what living truth is when you're here and you're present. It's like you're in the real world. Because a lot of the time, a lot of our anxieties are future things that might not even happen, and a lot of our guilt and our shame are misinterpretations of a past event or ruminations on an event that's already been dealt with. So I think that's really important, and I completely agree. It's one of those things that has to ground me in the day, in the morning, and then the day is just helps me deal with life a lot better because my view on the world is clearer.
Right. Grounding is actually, I think, is a great word to use there. There's in Greek, ancient Greek / medieval philosophy, there's this idea of distinction between ratio and intellectus, right? The rational mind and the intellectual mind. Whereas in our modern day, we've sort of like merged these two things together. In the ancient medieval philosophy, they were always separate, and the reason they're separate is precisely for the reasons that you said. The rational mind is the one that thinks. Okay, the rational mind is the one that does the work. So if I'm doing mathematics, right, if I'm doing maths, it's a rational mind doing it. If I'm doing physics, so if I'm doing symbolic logic, right, it's a rational mind doing the work. Whereas in Greek philosophy / medieval philosophy, the intellectual mind is the one that doesn't do the work, right? What happens is that it gets ideas or epiphanies, right? Like people have had epiphanies throughout human history. Scientists, philosophers have had epiphanies, and they'd say, and so these philosophers will say they happen not to the rational mind, but it happens in the intellectual mind, or the intellectus. And that's because the intellectual mind, the analogy which is used is the intellectual mind is like your eye, right? So when you guys step out and you look at a scenery, you don't think, okay, I see a mountain, I see one tree, I see two trees, I see a blade of grass, I see the clouds here. You absorb all of it at once. And when you hear a song in the midst of a cafe, right? A song's playing, you're talking to your friend, and then say John Mayer comes on, boom. You're not intentionally listening for that song, but when that music comes out, and if you say you know John Mayer, you're like, oh, you can tune in, and you can tune into the rest of your surrounding. And so I think the practice of meditation, of solitude, helps you to hone the intellectual mind versus the rational mind. And our world is focused on merging these two together and saying, look, it's only in the past 10 years that mindfulness has actually become a hot word to use. Before that, people used to make fun of meditation, right? Before, if you guys remember, what's that app? Headspace. When Headspace was trying to raise the VC funding, they were laughed out the room. They're like, why the heck would anybody use a meditation app? But now it's like the cool thing to meditate and do all these things. But that's like I guess that's a simplified version of the distinction becoming alive again, where the rational mind and the intellectual mind, they're two separate domains. Both are very important, but both do very different functions. And when you meditate, when you pray, the intellectual mind gets sharpened. Like similar to like you're able to see clearer, you're able to see better, you're able to see further, you're able to see the colors better. You can hear and pick up different noises, and even hear details that you like soft sounds that you would never hear before. So that distinction, I think, is important to bring back into our modern day, because we've separated it. because once you make that distinction, it actually makes life much easier. So an example would be, as both of you mentioned, it's very easy to get caught up in the noise and to just clock in your time, right? Go from one thing to another without ever thinking about it. And you say you decide to take break. You decide to take, you know what, I'm going to take a Sunday off, right? I'm going to take it off and just chill. But what often happens is, because we have this understanding, there's no distinction between the rational mind and intellectual mind. When you take a break, what you often end up doing is you end up doing trivial, menial rest, right? Which would be like scrolling social media, scrolling, what's that? Social, I don't know, Instagram, scrolling Instagram, TikTok, watching YouTube videos, watching Netflix. And you think that's rest, right? Because to you, well, your whole life you've been taught working is, if I'm thinking, I'm working, right? If I'm working, I'm working. If I'm doing, say, a servile, some sort of like physical work, I'm working. And so, because there's no distinction, you think that the way to rest is by not working. And that's me mindlessly scrolling because I'm not working. But then when you bring that distinction of the intellectual mind, you realize that you still have to do work, but it's a different type of work, right? It's a type of work where you are similar to, I don't know if you guys are like into swords and stuff, but similar to like or blades for that matter, similar to like if you have a knife and you use it when you're out in the woods all the time, obviously it gets blunt, right? It's very important that you sharpen your knife, even just your kitchen knife, after using it several times. If you don't do that, you start cutting, if we're talking about the kitchen context, you start cutting an onion and it doesn't slice so well and you start crying and you feel like, oh shit, this is terrible. But if you take time and realize that, the sharpening of my knife, it requires work, but it actually makes the work that I will do with it way easier. Then you go, okay, the rest that I'm doing is not a mindless activity. It's actually an intellectual work where I'm engaging in things that are good for my mind, right? So you like, meditation. Meditation is a form of work, right? And that's what I'm saying. We are starting to bring that distinction back. It's just people don't seem to talk about that distinction.
You just sharpen the brain.
That's right.
Nice.
That's the thing.
My sort of final question, I don't know if Jacob's got any final thoughts before we go, but this will be my last point, is be interested to see what you say to this. And at the beginning of the conversation, one of your first responses when I asked you why you do the things you do, why you do this research and make these podcast episodes and write these Substack articles and things, is because learning from great minds in history informs you on how you want to live your life and what you want from your life. So do you think, as you're older and more wise than Jacob and I, could you tell us what you think you want from life at this point in time?
I don't know if I wouldn't say I'm wiser than you guys. Your question is, what is it that I want from my life?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I think what I want from my life is, I think, best summarized with what Confucius says in the Analects. And he says, and I cannot remember it word for word, but he says something along the lines of, at 15, I set my mind on learning. At 30, I understood the way. At 40, I started living the way. At 50, I firmly believed in what I was doing. At 60, I forget what he does at 60, but at 70, what my heart and my mind desired aligned with what, obviously we're talking about Chinese philosophy here, but what my heart and my mind desired was in line with the way. And so what I want in my life is essentially that, is to get to a point full stop. And whether that happens tomorrow, whether that happens in 40 years, whether that happens in 20 years, whether that happens on my deathbed, where what I desire and want, both intellectually and emotionally and spiritually and whatever it is, it aligns with what is good for me and good in general, right? Good as in the like natural way. because without that, there is not too much point in pursuing things that are going to be detrimental to your mind, to your soul. So if my goal was to become the most famous, become the most famous podcaster in the world, right? And that was my sole goal, and there was nothing else to it. I do believe if somebody sets their mind to putting in the work, you could do a lot more than what you could think, right? And so even if I end up getting there, even if I'm not saying that's my goal, but let's say I got to it and I'm now super well known. I suspect that when I get there, it will not be the thing that I wanted to begin with. Right? I'll find out that the thing that I desired was not to be praised by others, but it was that there was a lacking in me because I didn't understand that all that I needed was not the approval of others, was not the praises of others, but that I had to create a fortress in my mind where I could run to and find peace. And that was, I suspect that that's what it would be if that was what I was pursuing. So, in long way of answering it is to get to a point where the man that I am is somebody who loves deeply, right? Strongly, but not just even that. It's somebody who can stand up for the weak and be willing to risk my life for the things that I believe in, right? Say you see a fight that's happening, right? And say somebody's getting attacked, okay? Up until this point, you talked about protecting others, being there for the weak, and standing up for truth. And you truly believe that one should. You truly believe that somebody should not be killed for no reason. So you see a robbery taking place, okay? You see an old woman getting robbed of her stuff and getting physically assaulted by somebody. In that moment, your conviction and your ability to execute on that conviction becomes very important. Because most people will say, "Oh yeah, I would have stood up for this lady. I would have put myself in between this fight and broken up." That's absolute garbage. Like, no, not nobody. A lot of people don't do it, right? A lot of people will just sit there and rather witness somebody getting beat up and pull out their phone and record it. Where it becomes extremely important for me is if I'm seeing that, there's no chance in hell that I stand back, right? Because then what I believe, what I stand for is at odds with my actual action. I become a talker versus somebody who actually walks what I practice and preach. And so with what Confucius says ultimately is you get to a point where what you practice and what you preach are one thing. And so that's essentially to become a walker, not just a talker.
Yeah, that's nice.
That's really nice. Yeah, the unity of mind and action in the search for good.
Finish line you can kind of maintain.
Yeah.
What's that?
A finish line that you can maintain.
Yeah.
If people want to find out more about what you do and your stuff, where should they go?
They can go to becomingantifragile.com, and the pod's there. The newsletter is also there, and the podcast is available on all the major platforms: Spotify, iTunes, Buzzsprout, and all those elsewhere. And then if they want to look for the writing specifically, they can go to Becoming Antifragile. It's there, or they can just go to ijmakan.substack.com. And then if you're on social, which I think that's where we connected, I think it's IJ Makan on Instagram, and that's like the main place that I'm at. Yeah, I appreciate the having me on.
No,
Appreciate you guys having me on.
It's been great to have you on, given a lot to think about. especially like when I re-listen to this. Yeah, thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, guys.